Hey, everybody. Welcome back to session 5, Input and Output. I'm your chair, Johann Wentzel, and we've got 3 presenters today. So let me get into the first presentation. So first off, we've got Comparing Smartphone Speech Recognition and Touchscreen Typing for Composition and Transcription by Margaret Foley. So I'll let Margaret take it away.
Hi, I'm Margaret Foley. I'm a master's student at Waterloo, and I'll be presenting my work, Comparing Smartphone Speech Recognition and Touchscreen Typing for Composition and Transcription, which I did with my supervisor, Dan Vogel, and with Jurie Casier. A few years ago, a study at Stanford compared typing and speech recognition for smartphones. Several websites found this study and used it to write some rather clickbaity articles. Evidently, these websites never read past the abstract, or they would have noticed that this study only tested transcription. And transcription is not representative of how we typically use mobile phones. Which begs the question, what happens when speech recognition and touch-based keyboards are compared for a phrase composition task? Transcription is, by and large, the de facto task for text entry evaluations, and for good reason. It has high internal validity. The correct version of a sentence is already known beforehand, which makes calculating error rates easy. In contrast, composition is a much more variable task. No two people will compose the same sentence given a certain stimulus. How do you determine what the correct version of a sentence is? Bertanen and Christensen found that the variability inherent in composition tasks can be controlled enough to evaluate text entry. And several studies have compared typing and speech with a composition task. However, the studies I found are all over 10 years old at least, and used outdated speech recognition technologies. Only one of these studies examined input on a mobile phone, using a T9 keypad. In general, studies comparing these forms of input have found that speech is faster than typing. We hypothesized that speech would be slower and more error-prone for composition tasks, as when you use speech for composition, you have to think of the entire phrase before you begin input. And unlike when typing, you can't pivot midway through a sentence. Speech may also be more error-prone because you can't easily correct errors mid-input. You need to wait until you're finished talking before you can go back and fix errors. Our other hypotheses are directly taken from the Stanford study, to see if we could have similar findings to them. Our composition task was quite simple. Participants are presented with 3 clip art images like the example you see here. We refer to these as image triads. Participants are asked to compose a short phrase incorporating these images that was coherent and grammatically correct. Here are some examples of phrases participants came up with for this triad. As you can see, this form of stimulus still leaves room for participants to be creative with their compositions, but it gives structure to their compositions. Here are some more examples of image triads we used in our experiment. Now, instead of showing the same set of triads for both input conditions, we had a second set of similar but different images, like these. We used this because while we needed to be able to compare compositions between input methods, we were worried that participants might remember an image triad from previous conditions and reuse a composition. For our transcription task, instead of just selecting a random number of phrases from a well-known phrase set, we had participants transcribe their own compositions and phrases from a common pool from the first 11 participants. Our study used a 2x2 within subjects design, where participants did 2 tasks with 2 input methods. The study was split into 2 sessions. Participants first completed the composition task, and then the transcription task in another session, at least a day later, to ensure fatigue concerns weren't an issue. In each session, they would compose or transcribe 20 phrases with each input method. We also had participants complete the TLX questionnaire after completing an entry method to evaluate subjective measures like how frustrating the task was. In total, we recruited 28 participants. All participants in our study had to be fluent in English. If English is not a participant's first language, they had to have a TOEFL score of 110 or higher, or an equivalent score in a similar assessment. As for measures, we had our time-related measures, like input time and prep time, which was the time from when participants first saw a stimulus to when they began input. For error rates, we measured how many errors went corrected and uncorrected during input. And we had our subjective measures, such as TLX scores, participant preferences, as well as any comments they made during the experiment. Now for results. We found that speech is far faster than typing for both transcription and composition. However, if you look at graph A, you'll notice that speech requires more preparation time than typing for both composition and transcription. Essentially, this means that for both tasks, participants had to think more before beginning input with speech. For error rates, we found that keyboard has a higher corrected error rate for composition. And while it had a higher corrected error rate for transcription, we didn't find this difference to be statistically significant. As for our uncorrected error rate results, you'll notice that all the bars are below 1%, which means that these results are too low to really be of note. For the TLX scores, for the transcription task, speech outperformed keyboard for every single metric. While keyboard had better TLX scores for some measures for the composition task, we didn't find a significant main effect of input there. For user preferences, unsurprisingly, for transcription, all participants preferred speech. However, for composition, a slight majority of participants actually preferred using the keyboard. Participants noted that they felt awkward with using speech. Even when it was just me and them alone in a room, some noted they still felt awkward composing short phrases in front of another person. And even people who said that they liked using speech had privacy concerns, with some people saying that, this is fast and very efficient, but I wouldn't want to use speech input in a public place or when I'm saying personal things. So, for our conclusions, for composition and transcription, speech is faster. However, participants do not greatly prefer speech recognition with a composition task. There are two avenues for future work that we'd like to examine. The first is comparison with previous work. As I previously mentioned, a paper by Virtanen and Christensen found that composition can be used for text entry evaluation. In this work, they also suggest a prompt for use in composition tasks. The obvious question is, how does this prompt compare with our own task? It would be interesting to examine whether this prompt is potentially a bit too open-ended or possibly biased towards recall, as it tells participants to think about things they often write about on their own mobile devices. Another avenue is to examine longer composition tasks, such as creative prompts, explanatory prompts, and showing participants more triads. Does speech lose its advantage when there's more input? After all, it's one thing for speech to be more efficient for short sentences. But what happens when you have to input punctuation? And how do you correct errors when there are multiple phrases of input you need to look over? Finally, how does creativity affect results? A person with experience in improv or debate might be better at thinking of things on the fly and have an easier time with composition tasks. From experience during the experiment, there were definitely some participants who had a lot of trouble with composition tasks. But that raises the question of how do you quantify and assess creativity? And how do you do it in a time-efficient manner? In summary, speech is very efficient, but people aren't likely to make it their primary form of input on their phones anytime soon. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Awesome, great presentation, Margaret. So I had a couple of questions. So for the first one, So how did you determine the correct versions of participant compositions?
So, system where we had two people go over every composition that people made and determine the correct version of a sentence. For most phrases, this was pretty easy. Most people had no errors whatsoever. But there were a few where people made typos or the wording was a bit ambiguous. But overall, it was a pretty easy process, and there was a high amount of agreement between the editors of the sentence.
Okay, that's great. So then, where is it? Oh yeah, here we go. Was there any advantage of using your process to generate transcription sets?
Our idea in doing that was to reduce variability and increase the validity of comparing both composition and transcription, because while I do note that there are a lot of publicly available phrase sets for text entry that have been used in lots of experiments, if we'd used them, it calls into question, like, are they really comparable to the phrases people composed using the image triads? Now, we did find that there was no difference between using phrases from the individual and phrases from the group, so that wasn't a confounding factor. But I think overall, it did help increase the internal validity of the experiment.
Okay, awesome. So I'll give it a couple of seconds if there's any other questions coming in. Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Margaret. I guess we can move on. So next up, we've got Erin Kim presenting Defining Haptic Experience, Foundations for Understanding, Communicating, and Evaluating HX.
Hi, my name is Erin Kim, and today I'll be presenting the work that I completed with Dr. Oliver Schneider, Defining Haptic Experience, Foundations for Understanding, Communicating, and Evaluating HX. Haptic technology is growing, becoming increasingly more incorporated into interactive systems with the intent to improve the user experience. Now, haptic feedback comes in various modalities. We see it commonly in the form of vibrotactile feedback in smartphones and wearable devices, or as force feedback, like in the Phantom devices, which have several applications. We can also see it in the newer electrovibration technology, which uses haptic feedback to render the feeling of specific textures. Now, with this growing sophistication of these technologies, research has demonstrated that haptics certainly do leave a positive impact, building a sense of presence in virtual environments and adding an overall sense of enjoyment and novelty to an experience. And so, while we know that haptics can offer a positive experience, the field has yet to articulate what exactly within the experience of haptics makes it positive. And so we're going to tell you what makes a good haptic experience by defining haptic experience and presenting to you a model that describes its components. Now, why is something like this useful? Well, because without such a model, we're limited in several ways. Consider Raj, our hard-working fellow haptician. Raj has big dreams. He wants to build a note-taking tablet using electrovibration technology that renders the feeling of paper. Now, when Raj puts his mind to something, he is determined to achieve a standard of excellence. And so he says to himself, I'm going to make sure the haptic feedback on this tablet makes for a great experience. But he quickly realizes that he doesn't actually know what he means when he says this. What does it mean to have a good experience with haptics? And so he asks around, and no one really seems to know, and the answers that he does get seem to differ across those he asks. And so the first limitation we run into from not knowing what constitutes good haptic interactions is in the design process. Hapticians like Raj are left without a universal set of design criteria. In other words, Raj doesn't know what to aim for. Now let's say he makes it through the design process and builds a system. Eventually, he'll face another challenge when it comes to evaluation. If Raj doesn't know what the standards are of an ideal haptic experience, he won't know what to measure to determine if those standards have been met. Now, there are evaluation tools that hapticians like Raj could use and have used, like those that measure presence, affect, and user experience. And while these are useful, they don't reference the haptics themselves. And so for someone like Raj, who's interested in identifying areas that need to be improved in the haptics specifically, existing evaluation tools don't allow him to accomplish this. Furthermore, a limitation that might become evident throughout the entire process of building this system is the struggle of trying to communicate about haptics, be it when trying to articulate design goals or elicit feedback. And this can really only be expected, because currently there exists no language for touch that holds terms with consistent meanings, and users can typically only explain what they like or dislike, but struggle to articulate about touch sensations beyond that. And so to address these issues that hapticians like Raj face, in design, evaluation, and communication, we define haptic experience, a term that captures interactions with haptic technology belonging to a greater system. Furthermore, we've developed a model that defines its constituents, serving as the terms and constructs necessary to talk about and evaluate the haptic portion of any system, leaving hapticians like Raj with the foundations necessary to know what it means to have a successful haptic system and to achieve just that. And so I'll walk you through how we arrived at this model. So because we are defining a new concept, we took a bottom-up approach by bringing in a group of haptic novices. And so 8 individuals were brought in. Participants varied in their field of study, as well as their experience with video games, and each were limited in their knowledge of haptics. And so we began with a brief presentation to familiarize participants to haptic technology and its various applications. And at the end of the presentation, participants were given 5 minutes to independently brainstorm ideas in response to the question, what constitutes a good haptic experience? Ideas were then presented one at a time and clustered together based on related concepts. Afterwards, participants played a series of games on the Nintendo Switch, which is a system offering vibrotactile feedback. These games were selected based on the variation of haptic feedback intensity, diversity of effects, and the necessity of the haptics to complete the game. And so once all the games had been tested and they now had first-hand experience with haptic feedback, we again asked the question, what constitutes a good haptic experience? Any additional items were added to the first pool of ideas, and each cluster was assigned a label by the novices according to its theme. And so then we took the results of the novice brainstorm to generate a series of items. And so here are the novice brainstorm results in its raw form. An example of a category that the novices developed is variation in feedback intensity, which spoke to whether the haptic effects noticeably varied in their strength to reflect its purpose or what was going on in the context of the game. Another category that resulted was called combining the senses, which referred to how well the haptics matched the other sensory outputs the novices experienced at the time. And so these were 2 of the many categories that they developed, which were incorporated into our final model, and thus will be explained more in depth later on. We then looked to experts to revise these ideas and to add their own contributions. And so we began with an open card sorting task with the previously generated items. And so they were instructed to group items together based on their own set of criteria and assign labels to each cluster. And so the goal of this was to see how experts conceptualized how novice ideas should be grouped together. Then upon completing the task, we began a semi-structured interview. And so here we asked the experts to explain their thought processes behind how they organized the items, asked if any revision should be made to specific items, and then began a discussion about how they've evaluated haptics in the past. So the model was largely developed through the results of the card sort task, but the interviews also brought some really interesting insight into current methods and barriers for evaluating haptics. So, when asked how they've evaluated haptics in the past, the most commonly mentioned method was surveys, which was mentioned by 3 experts. One expert administered a self-developed scale after being unsuccessful in finding a similar tool in the literature. Another considered using a validated questionnaire, but found that a lot of the items were not directly applicable to haptics. And they stated, it would be great to have something similar that focuses on our needs. Furthermore, barriers noted by experts included the fact that evaluation methods tended to differ between hapticians, with one expert stating, it would be great to have a consistent tool because I think everybody at the moment is building their own approach. Another stated, it's very hard to compare your haptic feedback, your haptic device, with others because of course when everybody uses their own method to evaluate, it's very hard. Another noted barrier is the difficulty in drawing out useful language. One expert stated, a lot of people don't know what haptics is, don't know to expect it, so you're challenged to get people to articulate in ways that are useful to you. And so these interviews gave us insight into what limitations our model could eventually be used to address. And so we took all of our novice and expert feedback to develop the model itself. And so overlapping results between experts were combined, and then when possible, specific categories were selected over broader ones to create a more granular model. And so then constructs were labeled based on expert and novice suggestion or based on terms that already exist in the literature. And so after conducting our studies, we have defined HX as the following: a distinct set of quality criteria combining usability requirements and experiential dimensions that are the most important considerations for people interacting with technology that involves one or more perceived sense of touch, possibly as a part of a multisensory experience. We have also formed the constituents of the HX model. And so using the skeleton of many UX models, our model captures both the pragmatic usability requirements and the hedonic experiential dimensions of the experience. And so to go through the model, we'll begin with the design parameters. This is otherwise known as the HX building blocks, the aspects that are changed at the designer end to achieve the various components of HX. So in terms of haptic effects, timeliness refers to their temporal alignment with corresponding events. Intensity is the strength or magnitude of the effects. Density is the quantity of effects present within a given period of time. And timbre is their overall unique tone, color, or quality. Usability requirements then describe the functional aspects of HX that achieve a practical value in the haptic systems. And so utility asks the question, is it useful? And what it looks at is whether the haptics serve as this additional channel through which information can be transferred, either to enhance user performance or enable a skill that would not otherwise be available. Causality then asks if you can identify the source of feedback, whether the haptics are designed in such a way that the users can easily understand what caused it. Consistency is a technical requirement, asking if haptic effects reliably feel the same each time when they should. And lastly, saliency asks if the feedback is appropriately noticeable. In other words, does it capture your attention when it should, or does it blend in nicely in the background when necessary? We then have experiential dimensions, so the factors that achieve a hedonically enjoyable interaction. And so harmony was a dimension that arose in all expert results and noted multiple times as one of the most important themes for HX. So one of our experts stated that you can have a really simple haptic effect, but as long as it matches up well with the rest of the system, it can still be really effective. So harmony asks, how well does a haptic fit in with the remainder of the system? How tightly coupled it's perceived to be with the other sensory outputs? Expressivity then asks if there's diversity in haptic effects and if they're each unique and distinguishable. Immersion refers to the level of engagement that haptic solicits for the user. Realism asks whether the haptic effect convincingly portrays what the user would expect to feel in reality. And lastly, autotelics is a dimension that was actually suggested by one of our experts. It concerns whether the haptics feel good in and of themselves. And so autotelics is a strictly hedonic-driven dimension, but it was included in this model because pleasurable haptics, apart from its context, can still contribute to a positive overall experience with the haptic system. And lastly, the model concludes with personalization support. So the ability for users to customize their experience to accommodate for individual differences in the perception and preference for touch. And so now with this model, we can now revisit where we noticed a gap in our field. What we weren't able to articulate about haptics before, we can now do so with the HX model to explain what elements of haptics contribute to a positive experience. So how can we use this model? Well, it can be used by various people in different roles. For example, for the designer, this model provides an organized template for thinking about design for haptic technology, a universal set of design markers that can lead to improved connections and collaborations between all kinds of designers. Then for the researcher, the model can guide future work. The model's constituents can serve as constructs that can be further explored in research. So for instance, exploring the influence of individual factors, searching for meaningful relationships between constructs, or determining if certain factors are prerequisites to others. Then, for the designer, researcher, and user, the model provides a set of vocabulary that can be commonly used to better articulate haptic experiences, be it whether you're trying to elicit or provide feedback. Furthermore, the model can now be used as this theoretical foundation from which consistent evaluation metrics can be developed that touch on haptics specifically. And so haptic-specific evaluation tools derived from this model permit users to more easily identify the strengths and weaknesses of a system, and then also allows designers to not only measure the improvement of their systems, but to have concrete data that vouches for the benefit of implementing haptic technology. And so the intention of this model is to unify designers, initiate the exploration of new haptic constructs, increase the ease of communication, and pave the way for consistent evaluation tools, all for the purposes of driving forward the field of haptics. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Erin. So I'll give it a couple of seconds for a few questions to come in.
Sure.
All right. First question. So this is really fascinating foundational work. I think your model gives designers a helpful language to talk about haptics, but do you think it's straightforward to introduce this vocabulary to users?
That's a good question. I would say yes, and a part of the reason I would say that is because quite a bit of this model is informed by novices, and so some of the labels that we kept are actually from those who didn't have a lot of experience with haptics. And one of the things that we had to keep in mind when selecting labels was to either use terms that had already been in literature, so even through that, if you're not familiar with haptics, hopefully there would be some sense of familiarity from other domains as well. And also most of the terms, like I said, because they're from users, they can hopefully implement that fairly quickly.
Okay, great. So another question. So you mentioned that you use the Switch Joy-Con for haptic testing. So how much does hardware matter? Like something like testing haptics versus on the Switch Joy-Con versus a steering wheel rumble feature versus a full body haptic suit. Were there any specific challenges or anything you can think of for designing haptic and evaluating haptics for those different hardware devices?
Mm-hmm. So with this model, we wanted to make sure that it was something universal across all haptic systems, and that's what we're working towards. So when we selected the Nintendo, we mainly picked it for its haptic feedback. So while hardware is an important component, we actually excluded some of the novice data that focused specifically on hardware. So for instance, one of the categories that the novices came up with was ergonomics of the controller. But with this model, what we were really focusing on was how are the haptics in light of the system and not so much the hardware that delivers it. And so while that plays a role, I think in terms of our model, and so I think that's what makes it universal, though, that it can be applied to haptic feedback being delivered across any kind of system.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So are there specific challenges regarding, say, hardware haptics versus implementing this for, say, a passive haptic system or something that uses something like haptic retargeting or some other kind of more software haptic system?
So it kind of sounds like this is a question surrounding universality of the model. And so I think I'll start by saying that, as you saw, most of the model was informed by vibrotactile feedback delivered through the Nintendo Switch, and that's where we started. But then we took those ideas and refined it with experts who come from backgrounds of all different kind of haptic modalities. And so not only did they speak of things obviously besides the Switch, but they also talked about works that they were currently working on and also where haptics could go in the future. And so I wouldn't say it's so much of a barrier where the haptics come from, but I think the model keeps into account that this can be applied for kind of any kind of haptics, and at least that's what we're working towards now.
Okay, great. I will give it a couple more seconds in case there are any other things rolling in.
That's good.
Cool. Well, great presentation, Erin. So I guess now we can move on to manipulation, learning, and recall with tangible pen-like input presented by Lisa Elkin. So this is a video is of a slightly shorter format since it doesn't have a pre-recorded talk as of yet, but this is still a full Chi paper. So we'll show the video figure now.
This video demonstrates two experiments and our hardware device used to investigate Conte manipulation and recall. Conte is a tangible pen-like input device that can execute commands based on how it contacts a display. Our device can detect up to 26 different contacts, corners, edges, and sides, to trigger different commands. This PDF annotation application demonstrates a real-world use case. Contacts are classified using an internal IMU, and a specially designed case with pliable conductive corners enables it to work on any capacitive touch display. The device is wireless with an internal microcontroller, IMU, radio, and battery. Note that Vogel and Cassier's original Conte device only detected 10 contacts using a specialized tabletop. Our first experiment investigated the impact of device size on manipulation time. Participants transitioned back and forth between two experimentally controlled contacts in quick succession. 3D printed device mock-ups were used to create different sizes. A resistive touch sensor recorded touches, and color-based computer vision classified the contact. We tested 3 sizes of mock-ups. A digital pen mock-up was a baseline comparison. Our second experiment used our hardware Conte prototype to see how well people can recall contact-to-command mappings on a 3D spatial interface. Participants used the device to execute the command that matched the following icon. They could activate an on-screen novice guide to see how commands were mapped to Conte contacts. We tested all 26 contacts, and a simpler version with only 9 contacts located on one end. For comparison, the same task was used to evaluate a 2D grid-based spatial interface. Commands are located in grid cells and are selected by tapping the cell. Command locations appear after a short delay to facilitate novice use, but expert users can select commands immediately. We use the same set of 26 commands, and the same 9-command subset. After training, retention tests with no feedback or novice visualizations measured how well people remembered the command mappings. For additional details and experiment results, see the accompanying paper.
All right, great video, Lisa. So first question I had, I noticed that that the Conte device was a really interesting kind of addition to the standard stylus functionality. Did you find it to be much heavier than a standard touchscreen stylus?
Can you hear me?
Yep, yep.
No, so it's not a lot heavier. So I'll add a funny anecdote to the answer to this, which is that we wanted to include how much it weighed in the paper, but didn't have a scale that was sensitive enough to weigh it. So way back when the world was open, I brought Conte to the grocery store and put it on one of the checkout scales. I could get an accurate measurement of its weight. So no, it's not a lot heavier. It's 25 grams. Apple Pencil is 21 grams. So it's feels pretty equivalent to the standard commercial list.
Yeah, fair enough. Follow-up question: How much did it end up costing on that scale?
It's priceless, Johann.
Cool. So next one, I noticed the pliable conductive corners on Conte. Can you elaborate a bit more on the design of those?
Yeah, so anyone who was in the HCI lab at the time saw me sort of slaving away over the 3D printer for 4 months, and actually, I think much more difficult to make than they look like. So first of all, they're made of, you said they're made of a conductive material, and in order for that 3D printer filament to be conductive, it's infused with carbon, and there's some chemical property of carbon. When it gets hot, it gets really sticky and clumpy, so that made them pretty difficult to print because the nozzle would get clogged up. One other point that I want to draw attention to is that there's some filtering that happens on a touch screen so that it doesn't just assume that any conductive particles in the air touches. So what has to happen is that a touch has to have a certain surface area in order for it to be considered a touch. And so I had to model those corners in a way that they still felt pen-like, so they were still pointy enough. But I actually 3D modeled air pockets into the corners so that when they're compressed, they touch the screen with a larger surface area.
Oh, that's super cool. Question from the chat. How much do the 3D menus help people's memory? Do you think other weirder shapes would leverage people's spatial memory even more? What does the perfect 3D menu look like?
Okay, so those are great questions. I'll answer the weirder shapes question first. We purposely didn't want to have a weirder shape, but I do think that a weirder shape would help people's spatial memory. So the only spatial marks on Conte itself that distinguish different contact there's a white mark on the top and a white mark on the side. We did that on purpose because that gives users the least amount of information possible, the smallest amount of information that they need to distinguish contacts. So by showing that with a device like that, people can actually learn where these contacts are, we think that like we've showed the hardest case. And so yes, if you add more visually distinguishable landmarks, like using a different shape, specifically if something's asymmetric, we think that it would help people learn. So how much did the 3D menu help people's memory? I mean, I'm gonna assume you mean the guide that we showed on screen, and correct me if I'm wrong. So yeah, that definitely did help. I think without that, we wouldn't have been able to do the experiment at all. But what is important to note is that if you look in the paper, we show how like the rate of expert usage as the experiment went on. And so in the beginning, people really, really relied on those core guide on screen, but by the end, they were using Conte more or less without it and attained a pretty, I don't remember the exact numbers, but a pretty high amount of expert usage. What does the perfect 3D menu look like? That's a great question that I don't have the answer to, but I think that's a really interesting avenue for future work. Next question, did you find, oh, Johann, I'll let you read the next one.
Yeah, sounds good. So did you find that people with smaller or larger hands had more or less difficulty in manipulating the prototypes of various sizes? For example, did people with small hands have trouble manipulating large Conte?
Unfortunately, don't have data for hand size. And I don't know if we even tested, I guess we don't have data for hand size, so I don't know the answer to that question, but I did observe the experiments closely and didn't really notice a difference. I think the biggest issue is that the smaller the shape, it's harder just in general to get a grip on it. Like, I have pretty tiny hands, and I still found the largest one easier to manipulate and the smaller one harder to manipulate.
Okay, fair enough. One last question. Could you elaborate on the differences between this Conte and the original Conte?
I would be happy to. So one of the big differences is that the original Conte only worked on a Microsoft Surface tabletop, which is really expensive and really huge. And like, I don't know about you, Johann, but I don't have one of those lying around my house. So it meant that it was a really nice device in theory, and it was a prototype that was interesting just to show what it maybe kind of could do and look like, but it really wasn't practical in any sense and really didn't lead the way, like wasn't a proof of concept of how this thing could actually be built for realistic usage. Another thing that's really important to note is that because it used computer vision and because it used a specially designed tabletop, it could only tell what shapes were, but couldn't distinguish between similar shapes. So for example, in the 2011 paper, they could tell that a corner was touching the paper, but they couldn't tell which corner. They could tell the differences between small edges and large edges, but they couldn't tell the difference between two small edges. Because of that, I think they could only detect 10 different contacts. They couldn't actually test what a 26 contact input do. And so for our device, it was really important that it wasn't just, an updated version almost 10 years later, but we actually completely redesigned what an implementation of this device would look like. So by making it conductive, it can be used on any conductive surface, not just a giant Microsoft Surface table. It can be used on an iPad. We did experiments on my touch screen Lenovo laptop. And also because we use IMU data to figure out which contact touching, we were actually able to distinguish all 26 contacts, which meant that we were able to do these studies investigating whether people could learn to use it.
All right, awesome. I will give it a couple more seconds just to see if any other chat questions filter in, but this has been great. All right, great. So I think that marks the end of session 5, input and output. Join us again at 2:30 Eastern for session 6, menus and shortcuts. Thanks.